good, so we'll keep going. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us on this webinar. As you heard in the introduction, I'm going to repeat just one part of it, that if you do have any questions, we'll start taking questions after about 20 minutes into presentation. Please send them to Kirpa Kaur because she's the moderator. If you don't have a mic, let her know that as well. Now, moving on to why we are here today. I mean, you know, the Sikh world has been, and I'm just going to put the questions which Kirpa just read. And you know, the Sikh world and the non-Sikh world this month is commemorating 25 years of June '84 attacks. And yeah, there are different names for it, from Operation Blue Star to some people saying it's like a Lukara. And we'll get into all those issues. Up front, what I want to mention is that in history, they say 50 years is one day, which basically means that to understand what really happened, especially recent history, it takes a while. It's going to take a while for the Sikhs to really understand it from a Sikh angle. It's going to take all of us a while to understand and navigate through the propaganda which has been going on from various sides. So the idea today is to let's sort of look at some of the facts, and in doing so, what we have tried to do carefully within the Institute is not to really present much from, there are a couple of slides which will contextualize things from a Sikh angle, but we would like to show that what government said and what the independent sources said are two very different things. So these are the kind of questions. You'll have some more questions. If we don't cover any of those, please make sure that you send them to us. So essentially what I want to focus on today is the white paper. What is the white paper? White paper is the official document of the Indian government, which explain why they did what they did. So we'll examine that a bit. We'll also look at, and a large part of this presentation, substantial part I should say, is about the Indian Army. Because, you know, Army is not to be used for the citizens or for what they call police actions or civilian actions. So we really want to look at what were the generals in the Army, what were the internal reviews of the Army thinking at the time, and was it really something which Army agreed with? And so generals, I want to look at it from a Sikh angle as well as from the Indian Army angle. And we will try to sort of refute what the government's claims are through non-Sikh independent sources, with the exception of two slides where I want to contextualize things for audience today from a Sikh angle. Like there is a history of Sikh traditions of Kalukara and how to perceive all these events within that context. And then we'll look into what were the objectives of the third agency. This is actually a name of one of the agencies which was set up by the government of India at the time. And we'll look into what was their role in creating sort of the propaganda wars which existed afterwards. And then all this, how is all this relevant to you and me? That's the idea, you know. Once we learn this, what can you and I do? Okay, so with that, let me start out with simplified facts. First thing we know is that, and by the way, I'm only going to focus on June '84. So this is not about what happened in November '84. This is not about the decade plus long of Indians and the relationship between the Indian states and the Sikhs from '84 through '93 onwards. This is not about that. Pure focus today is on June '84. So we can be specific and really get into the nitty-gritties of what kind of things are in our minds and sort of create some clarifications for that. So first thing we know is that this attack, this operation, and we'll get into the nomenclature and vocabulary later, this happened at the time when people were gathered, Sikhs were gathered to commemorate the Martyrdom Day or the Shahidi Purav of Sri Guru Arjan Sahib, who is the 5th Guru Prophet of the Sikhs, which basically means that this is the time when the complex was to the full capacity, which means there were a lot of visitors, a lot of pilgrims, Shraddhalus, and this is the time when Army decides to go inside the complex. Second thing we know is that on June 3rd, there was going to be a launching of a massive civil disobedience movement for Punjab, from Amritsar, from Akal Takht. Various political factions were looking into doing it. So the point is there is going to be a starting of a huge civil disobedience movement on June 3rd as well. Third thing we know is that all the sources which we have looked at, independent sources, they said there was no opportunity given to either the pilgrims or the employees or the civilians who were in the complex to leave. And actually forget about giving them opportunity to leave, because army is being used, and this is why I mentioned this fact. Civilians and the employees and everyone who is not interested or is not part of the situation is supposed to be given a warning to leave. But not only were they not given any warnings, they were detained, arrested, and several of them were killed as well. Other thing we know is that if this was a civilian action, as government said, then why were the tanks used? Why was chemical gas warfare used, which is illegal according to the conventions with State of India has signed? So we'll really look into was it really what government said, is that really what happened? Not only are they violating the Indian laws, they're violating international conventions. Now, if they really went inside to capture, as government said, few terrorists, and that's government's version, and we'll look into that, why are they using 9 infantry divisions in conjunction with several paramilitary forces? So roughly 70,000 people on ground right there, and 150,000 total army personnel being used, armed forces personnel being used to run this operation. So basically, this will make you think that this is no small thing. This is no operation, as government called it. This is something much bigger, and we'll look into that as well. And then the Indian state claimed that this was the last resort, and they went inside the temple to seize the terrorists. Again, their vocabulary. And we'll look into these 6 claims. These are the facts we know. This is what was claimed. And the whole thing we want to get into from here onwards is what really happened, what are the independent sources saying. So first thing we know is that Punjab was cut off from the rest of the world. You can read the quote there that there's 24-hour curfew, no telephone is allowed, no telex is allowed, no foreigners are permitted, Indian journalists are not permitted, no newspaper, no trains, nothing can move. Now, this is really important for us to understand in the background. If Punjab is sealed from rest of the world, that there is no flow of information, no flow of traffic of any kind, who has something to hide? Why is the whole Punjab being sealed? So this is not just about Akal Takht. This is not just about Amritsar. This is about what is happening throughout Punjab. Okay? Second thing I want to get into is what the government claimed, that they went inside to seize the terrorists. This is Cynthia Kepley Mahmood's quote. She says, 70,000 troops in conjunction with the use of tanks and chemical gas killed hundreds, possibly thousands of innocent pilgrims, the day of the attack being a Sikh holy day. The Akal Takht was reduced to rubble, and the Sikh reference library, an irreplaceable collection of books, manuscripts, and artifacts burned to ground. 37 other shrines were attacked across Punjab on the same day. Let's look at this. If they really went inside the Darbar Sahib complex to capture terrorists, as government claimed, do you really need, they said they went there to capture 38 people. So to capture 38 people, you need 70,000 troops on the ground. Why are you taking tanks inside? Why are you using chemical gas warfare? Why are you going there at the time when there is the complex it has the highest level of capacity in terms of number of people inside? Why are you burning Sikh reference library as an afterthought? And why are you attacking simultaneously 37 other Gurdwara complexes in Punjab? And more than that, as I showed in the previous slide, why is the whole Punjab being sealed? Those are the questions we should be asking. So is it really to capture quote unquote terrorists, or is there some other bigger agenda going on? Moving on, and this is where I want to make a case that this is actually a part of state terror. What with the previous quote said there were tanks, there is a pictorial evidence. If you look at the top of the picture, you can see the tanks being parked there. This picture is important because you can see when we are saying chemical warfare was used, these are the army personnel standing with the gas masks. They're taking picture afterwards, obviously. So the point is, if they are wearing gas masks, what were they using? Illegal again, according to international conventions. This is again, bodies being dragged in the Darbar Sahib complex. This is just to show what was happening in there. Okay, so what's the point of all this? Well, point of all this is that you're using tanks, you're using soldiers with gas masks, you are dragging bodies right and left within the complex. This is something much more than a civilian or a police or operation to capture 38 individuals, which, by the way, Indian Parliament later admitted the 38 people they went inside to capture were not even in the complex. In fact, some of them were not even in the country. So obviously, different stories are being spun through the state television and the state media and the state newspapers. Okay. So people, government in the white paper says, and we'll get into specifics of this a little bit later as well, that, we really didn't kill any, civilians got killed because they got caught in the crossfire. Well, if you look at this picture, this basically is showing the turbans of the Sikh men were used to tie their hands behind their back, and eventually they were shot point blank. You don't need to listen to my words. I'll give you reference for that. This is important from a Sikh psyche angle. And let me talk about that before I share the quote, because quote just talks about purely from humanitarian angle, but there's a Sikh angle to it. Removal of a turban, all of you know, in Sikh context is huge. Sikhs in the history have said, I forget about removing my turban and my hair from my body, including from the head. I'd rather die. So when somebody is doing this, this is part of psychological torture as well. But we'll get into that a little bit later when we get into the Sikh context. But this is what the Guardian of London reported. Sikhs were shot at point blank range, their hands tied behind their backs with their turbans. It was a virtual massacre. A large number of women, children, and pilgrims were gunned down. The operative word here is shot at point blank range. Point blank range is, first of all, these are unarmed. Their hands are tied behind their back. Point blank range is they're standing right in front of you, pointing a gun at you and shooting in your head or wherever else. So this is what they call war crimes or crimes against humanity. Those kind of words can be used to describe these. From every measure, these are illegal activities. Okay, so when they say pilgrims or the civilians were caught in crossfire, well, the independent sources say not the case. Let me mention something here, what the government again claimed. Government says, white paper on Punjab agitation, this is the government's version, that no women or children were killed in the action by the troops. Well, Associated Press reported a team of doctors examined 400 corpses, including 100 women and 15 to 20 children, all under 5 and including a 2-month-old baby. Why is this important? So this is, by the way, this is not to be read as being that there were only 400 dead. This is saying they examined 400. Of the 400 dead which were examined, which Associated Press reported, 100 were women and 15 to 20 were children, all under 5, including a 2-month-old baby. So there is a blanket absolute statement by the government of India saying no women or children were killed in the action by the troops, whereas the independent media, not the Sikh media, presents that wasn't the case at all. Then the government said, General Sundarji, who was in charge of the operation, he said, we went inside, and what he implied by inside the temple, with humility in heart and prayer on our lips. Well, let's look at what the reality is. Karnail Kaur, a young mother of 3 children, recalls when people begged for water, some Jawans, which are the Indian Army soldiers, told them to drink the mixture of blood and urine on the ground. You decide whether this is prayer on their lips and some humility in their heart. Essentially, what the government version is and what the people have written afterwards are 2 very different versions. Now, there is this question which all of you, we mentioned in the beginning. Again, the terrorist is the word which government uses, and I keep saying that because we have to be very careful with these words. Weren't the terrorists armed and fighting back? Okay, let's look at it. Let's talk about it. GKC Reddy, in his book Army Action in Punjab, says, Operation Blue Star will go down in history as one of the biggest massacre of unarmed civilians by the organized military force of a nation. And look at the next part. He says the word unarmed is used deliberately as the disparity in arms on the 2 sides was so great that those resisting army invasion of temple could hardly be termed armed. Now let's look at it from a purely, again, technical way, and then we look into the Sikh context a little bit later. So even if there were few people, even if there were people inside the Darbar Sahib complex who were armed, he's saying what they were armed with can hardly be termed armed because what they were facing was, there is no comparison essentially. Again, these if you guys have questions, who ke GK is ready? You're sending me some questions. Please send them to a panelist, Kirpa, and then she can see which one needs to be forwarded. But who is GK say ready? He's the author of the book Army Action in Punjab. Okay. Then there are questions in their minds like, this was all part of a big political game. Is it? And that's the question I want to try to answer. And in trying to answering that, we'll mention what Joyce Pettigrew has written. She's the anthropologist from UK, Scotland, and she writes, it was an attack not on a political figure or movement, but to suppress a religion, to attack their heart, to strike a blow at their spirit and self-confidence. The army, which had suffered a heavy toll in the 3 days of battle, went berserk and killed every Sikh man, woman, and child who could be found inside the temple complex. They were hauled out of the rooms, brought to the corridors of the circumference of the temple, and with their hands tied behind their backs were shot in cold blood. I want you to focus on the first part. And this is really important because this is mostly what you hear. And this is what government tries to say over and over, that they went inside to capture those 38 people who they later admitted government that they weren't even inside. What Joyce Pettigrew is arguing is this is not to be seen as an attack on a political figure or a movement. Because if they are attacking everyone inside the complex, 37 other gurdwaras, and they're cordoning whole of Punjab, this is not really about few individuals or a political movement. This is actually about Sikhs at large. This is about what Sikhs stand for. This is about what the Sikh spirit has contributed in the South Asian history. And we'll get into that a bit again. Government also claimed that this was a last resort. Indira Gandhi, and we'll get into that they went inside the temple. She went on TV before the attack, and she says, we have tried every other thing, and we are going inside because we don't know what else to do. Well, let's look at that. This is a statement by Lieutenant General S.K. Sinha, the man who was asked to lead this operation. This is what he writes. The army action was not the last resort, as the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi would have us believe. It had been in her mind for more than 18 months. Shortly after the Akali agitation of 1982, the army began rehearsals of a commando raid near Chakrata cantonment in the Doon Valley, where a complete replica of Golden Temple complex had been built. Another training involving Radiation Research Center commandos was given in Sarsava area and Yamuna Bed in helicopters converted into gunships. I want all of you to really look at this. This is not from just a reporter or just an Indian intellectual, which we look at as well, and those statements are important. This is the man who was asked to lead this operation. He is saying this, who eventually actually said, I'm not going to do this. What he's saying is this was a very well-planned, systematic attack, which was prepared 18 months in advance, with complete replicas built. When you're doing all this, this means this is pre-planned. This is not something, as the government claims, they're going inside to capture terrorists, as government kept saying. S.K. Sinha is saying, no, this has nothing to do with it. We started this 18 months ago, much before it was was brought into public light within a week before June. He's saying this is very much a pre-planned thing, which was ordered by the Prime Minister at the time, Mrs. Gandhi. Okay. So is it a last resort? Of course it's not. Clearly it's not a last resort if it's being planned. Let's look at some pictures. This is a Darbar Sahib complex. In the middle is Golden Temple, which is what it's commonly called. Sikh parlance calls it Harinder Singh in Amritsar. And right across from there is Akal Takht. This is just before and after pictures. And this is the Akal Takht before 84. And this is what happens to it in June 84. I like to call it that the whole area, the spirit of what really happened, or the essence which captures what really happened, that everything was red there. It was red waters of Amritsar. This is what happened. The complex, which is symbolic of Sikh spiritual sovereignty and Sikh political sovereignty, was turned into red. This is a desecration of the highest kind, which was seen in the Mughal periods by the invaders. And we'll get into those comparisons a bit later as well. Okay, so why was this done? Well, part of the explanations comes that this was part of the bigger political issues happening in India at the time. And what I'm quoting here is, let's look into it, and I'll give you the reference. First thing is that this was to show, and there is a when they say it's a Hindu-Sikh conflict and Sikhs made into a Hindu-Sikh conflict, well, I'm countering that. What I'm countering with is that Sikhs never really made this a Hindu-Sikh conflict. It never was and never will be, because very Sikh ideology is against it. But the Prime Minister at the time did make it to clinch the Hindu vote in the rest of the country by giving a Sikh community a punch on the nose. So this was used as a pretext. Now let me get into it. These are the objectives of the third agency. In fact, let me put all of it so you know where it's coming from. Third agency, let me explain it a bit. This is reported by Surya magazine in their September issue of 1984. Third agency is the agency which was set up by Mrs. Gandhi as an alternative to RAW, which is Research and Analysis Wing of Indian government. It's a intelligence agency, and the other one in India is called IB, which is Intelligence Bureau. According, third agency was told by Mrs. Gandhi to go do this. Why? Because she needs to win elections, which were going to occur later in the year. The other was opposition was saying that, essentially this was to show to the opposition to Mrs. Gandhi that she can take care of anything, including attacking the Golden Temple. And third was she basically was trying to see if she can have a intelligence agency which will directly report to her rather than the bureaucratic systems of RAW and IB. So the point is, according to Surya magazine, a new intelligence agency was set up. It was just called Third Agency, and I'll get into the details of that, what exactly they did during this operation. So the point is, there's a politics involved. The politics was she wanted to be Prime Minister again, and as a pretext of that, she started playing certain games in order to win the majority community. Remember again, Sikhs are less than 2% of Indian population, so their electoral votes do not matter. 84% and 16% who count for the Hindu and Muslim populations do. Okay, so why is there such a confusion regarding June 84? If what I'm saying, and you might be thinking, what's Harinder, is he starting or is he mentioning more propaganda here? Well, whatever we have heard, I have relatives in India, I have heard this is what the Indian government says. So we have varieties of confusion. Even every Sikh is not sure what happened, and sometimes Sikhs are ready to believe the government versions. We know governments lie all the time. This is not just about Indian government, US government lies. You guys know what has been happening in the last 80 years there as well. The point is, where are those libertarian institutions who are supposed to check these governments when they are lying? And since they are not checking, there is utter confusion in India and outside India because of the massive propaganda. So why is there such a confusion? Subramanian Swamy in his book Creating a Martyr talks about this. He says government of India masterminded a disinformation campaign to create legitimacy for its actions. Its goal was to make out, and this is a quote, make out that the Golden Temple was the haven of criminals, a store of armory, and a citadel of nation's dismemberment conspiracy. Guys, look at this very carefully. Government of India masterminded a disinformation campaign to create legitimacy for its own action. Its actions or failures. And I'll get into the failure aspects with the internal documents of Indian Army. But why is there a confusion? Because a disinformation campaign was launched to give bad names to what was happening in Darbar Sahib complex and to present as people in Darbar Sahib complex and the nation's dismemberment conspiracy, which essentially means that Sikhs are somehow terrorists. And if you guys remember, this sort of a label existed for a long time, at least 10 years after June 84. Well, if you want to discover truth, you have to work hard at it, and let's look into it a little bit. So one of the questions might be, which comes in people's mind is, wasn't Bhindranwale a terrorist? Well, let's study this, how other people looked at him. First quote is pre-84, before 1984. And this is written in Indian Express by Arun Shourie. Those of you who might not know Arun Shourie, he, in last 10 years, also become the cabinet minister under the BJP government. So the alliance of BJP government, NDA alliance. The point is, this is the opposition to Mrs. Gandhi. But I'm saying he's a BJP leader and a known journalist. And he writes, before 84, for all I know, Bhindranwale is completely innocent, is genuinely and exclusively dedicated to the teachings of the Guru. Okay, so you might be thinking that, okay, well, maybe this is how he was, and then he changed. Well, I'll get into that a bit as well. But before I do that, I want you to know that June 84 is not about Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. It is about Pindranwale phenomena as I see it. Pindranwala is one individual, and we look into it because he is centrally located, and there is such a disinformation campaign about June 84 and about him. This is one of the reasons I want to spend 2-3 slides on him, because he is brought in as a central figure, and he is from a Sikh angle as well. But we need to look at that it is about more than Sant Jarnail Singh. Some people call him Sant, some call him Baba, some call him Jathedar. All those terms are equally relevant. We don't want to get into that debate. We want to keep focus on how is he seen in June 84 context. So let's look at in 84. Veer Sanghvi in 86, who currently writes for Hindustan Times as a known journalist, says, whatever Pindranwale's involvement, the government had no concrete evidence, and the ministry thought it inadvisable to arrest him on a flimsy case only to have him acquitted and transformed into a hero. So what he's essentially Veer Sanghvi is saying is that they really couldn't make a case against him, and they didn't want to, because they couldn't make a case against him, they didn't want to arrest him because they thought he'll become even more powerful figure afterwards. And the note I'm writing there is, one of the things which government says is that Pindranwale and his men and other people inside the temple were terrorizing people inside the temple. There is not a single report, either by any journalist or by police, that any armed political activity was terrorizing or intimidating anyone in the Darbar Sahib complex. And the picture I'm showing is on purpose of Sardar Kapoor Singh sitting with Jarnail Singh Pindranwale. Now, Sardar Kapoor Singh is, most people, if not all Sikhs will agree, is one of the leading thinkers of the last 50 years. He used to regularly see Jarnail Singh Pindranwale as well. Jarnail Singh Pindranwale is not the demonic, or as Tavleen Singh of India Today calls him, the prophet of hate. That's the propaganda against him. That's what Subramaniam Swamy was saying. The disinformation campaign was lost. If you look at reporters at the time, before and after, what they have to say on him is a very different story. Let's look into another thing. Wasn't Pindranwale's view extremist? Now, this is a long quote. On purpose, I'm showing this quote because there is a huge disinformation campaign about Jarnail Singh Pindranwale as well. This is by Vandana Shiva in a book called Violence of Green Revolution. I know it's a long quote, but let's dissect it a bit. The most ardent followers of Pindranwale in his first phase of rising popularity were children and women, both because they were relatively free of the new culture of degenerative consumption, and they were worst hit by the violence it generated. So let's look at it. She's basically saying, why did he become popular? Who was liking him? Who was liking him? Women and children, because he talked about he said to Sikhs basically, Nashe chhaddo. Nashe is addictions, whether it's drug or alcohol and pornography. He says all these nashes are what's creating a culture of what Vandana Shiva calls degenerative consumption. So women obviously loved him because he's taking men off of booze. He was socially active man. Let's look at the second phase. In the second phase of Pindranwale's popularity, men also joined his following, replacing vulgar movies with visits to gurdwaras and reading the Gurbani in place of pornographic literature. And when the movement started becoming successful, what Pindranwale was doing, she's saying that he gained legitimacy among men as well, and they started leaving again this culture of degenerative consumption and Gurbani in place of pornographic literature. So people are, what is he doing? He's connecting people with the Sikh values. That's what she's writing. The son's following grew as he successfully regenerated the good life of purity, dedication, and hard work by reviving these fundamental values of the Sikh religion's way of life. The popularity of Pindranwale in the countryside was based on this positive sense of fundamentalism as revitalizing the basic moral values of life that had been the first casualty of commercial capitalism. This is very important, guys. What she's saying is that the rise of Pindranwala, the way it's presented in certain Indian media outlets and by the government for sure, is very different. The reason he's popular is not because of it. Look at the way she uses, she says the word fundamentalism Vandana Shiva is using is in the context that he was taking people back to fundamental values of the Sikh faith. This is what he was about. This is what he did. And people who study him, whether it's Vandana Shiva or whether it's A.R. Darshi, I was rereading his book other day in preparing for this. A.R. Darshi is the Joint Secretary of Punjab, a non-Sikh, He wrote a book called The Gallant Defender, and he basically writes in there, he says that one of the people who disagree with what Pindranwale did, they essentially are the sectarian groups of the Sikhs. Basically, people who don't like the Sikhs, whether they are the Sikh subgroups or whether the Sikh religious denominations. Point is, if you feel taking people away from pornography, alcohol, and drug abuse is extremism, and Vandana Shiva was saying, well, this was the fundamentalism which Pindranwale was exercising, not the ones you hear about that he was about killing people who disagreed with him or Hindus. He never used those words or those sentences. Okay, this is where I want to get into the Sikh context of things, and then I'll come back to the army's debate on this issue. And after this, you are free to start sending your questions. So this slide I want to spend a little bit of time on. Basically, I want to get into how do some of the Sikhs look at these events. So far I've been presenting what was happening technically and the trivial information about June 84. Sikhs have a tradition of Kallukaras. Ratan Singh Pangu is one of the authors, and Randhawa is a Muslim author from Pakistan. His name is Ahmad Hasan Randhawa. What I'm talking about here is Sikh tradition is that in Darbar Sahib complex, because this question is in people's minds as well, why were Pindranwale and few people who stayed back, why did they fight in Darbar Sahib complex? What I'm trying to present here is that there is a Sikh tradition to do that. When Ahmad Shah Abdali in 18th century was attacking Darbar Sahib complex, there are enough testaments and witnesses as well as historical evidences that Sikhs stayed back and they fought in Darbar Sahib complex with the people who were attacking. Ratan Singh Pangu writes about Baba Gurbaksh Singh Nihang that in the 6th attack of Abdali, he stayed back and fought along with 27 other men to defend the sanctity of Darbar Sahib complex. And he said, knowing that they will die there. Marriage party quote I'm putting is, because the way Ratan Singh Pangu describes it, that these men knew they will die because they were outnumbered, but they basically said that today we are getting married, implying that they are marrying death. This is where Professor Puran Singh, a great poet of the Sikhs, also says, death is the bride of the brave. So this idea of fighting in Darbar Sahib complex to defend its honor, its sanctity, or what Patwan Singh will say, it took the sweat and the bloods of several generations of Sikhs to first build Darbar Sahib complex, then to defend it and to rebuild it. This is the angle. Now, when you look at this in 84's context, Ahmad Hasan Randhawa in his poem called Odak Mukegi Raat, he says Jarnail Singh Pindranwale was following the Sikh traditions. He uses the phrase for him, Jarnaila da Jarnail, general of the generals. Word Jarnail in Punjabi means general. He's basically saying what Pindranwale did in the Sikh tradition is what the Sikh tradition asks for, to defend the sanctity of this place. And even if you know that eventually you're going to die. Jarnaila da Jarnail, why is he calling him general of the generals? Because the very decorated generals of the Indian army, when Pindranwale gave a call to defend the sanctity, came and served under General Jarnail Singh Pindranwale. So the point is, Indian army decorated soldiers, decorated general, came to serve under him. So he's a general of the generals. Again, looking at it from a Sikh angle a bit. Another angle I want to give is how we look at these, this whole idea of Operation Blue Star. Well, we know historically, like what happened during Maharaja Ranjit Singh period, every book we read, almost every book says they were Anglo-Sikh wars. But we know that the eyewitness account of a Muslim writer named Shah Muhammad, he says this was not Anglo-Sikh wars in 1849 or 1840s rather. They were actually they were wars between Hindustan and Punjab. Jang Hind Punjab da hon laga. That's what he writes. That this was a battle between Punjab and India, because who fought on the behalf of the British? It were the Indians who conspired against the Sikhs to annex the Punjab. I want to apply similar historical context to what happened in 1984. Operation Blue Star is not the way to look at this. There have been several battles in Amritsar. We should be calling this from a Sikh angle again, not the government angle, not just the operational angles, from a Sikh historical context. This is a battle of Amritsar. There have been battles of Amritsar before. This is the Indo-Sikh battle of Amritsar, where Sikhs in their tradition agreed or disagreed. You and I can disagree with this, but that's besides the point. This is to understand what is happening. That in their tradition, they fought with the 4th largest standing army in the world at the time. So the question is, what really is happening here? What is really happening here? Fourth largest standing army. Remember earlier Subramanian Swamy and other people said in other courts I presented that there was a disinformation campaign because army really screwed it up. When they screwed it up, they went berserk and they started killing people. What happened? The 38 people they cited, but let's say 100, maybe 200 people who were fighting on behalf of the Sikhs with a very sort of basic arms. They held the fourth largest standing army of the world for 56 hours. Now, Sikh tradition is very proud of that when we talk in the pre-84 era, whether it was battles which Sikhs have fought on behalf of the British, whether they did it during Banda Singh Bahadur period, or whether they have done it during Guru Gobind Singh period or Guru Hargobind Sahib period. So this is another way to look at it, that it's not an operation, this is a battle of Amritsar. Third angle I want to present is looking at the whole thing of this character assassination of Sikh heroes. Now, Sikh heroes from a Sikh angle, obviously. And I want to present again a look at how to look at this again in 84 context. Banda Singh Bahadur is a one hand-picked leader by Guru Gobind Singh in the post-Guru period. If you look at the books and the information on Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, who's considered the general of the Sikhs, and who's the one who ended the Mughal dynasty in India, essentially, there's so much confusion in Sikh masses about it. People say he was like this, he was like that, he shouldn't have done this. But remember, he's the only hand-picked leader we have who was hand-selected by Guru Gobind Singh. Just like not only was he tortured and his son was tortured, and not a single man gave up his life, and he died defending what he believed in, the ideas of Sikh ideals. There's so much character assassination of him. We can apply the same thing to Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. The man not only died for his belief, again, you and I can disagree with his approach, but he did what he said he would do. He did an ardas and he stayed in the Darbar Sahib complex and defended its sanctity. Look what happened after that. We have much more character assassination. This is something which we need to understand and become more clear about, that not only assassination is enough, or from a Sikh angle martyrdom, that there is going to be disinformation campaign, just like in the Banda Singh Bahadur case, there is similar thing happening in Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale's case of character assassinations. Okay, so within this Sikh context, I also want to mention that in Sikh principles, there is zero tolerance for vengeance or revenge or hatred. Sikh ideology does not believe in this, but there is a Sikh ideology, what I'm labeling here, doctrine of love and justice. That for us, love and justice go hand in hand. Sikhs are given this doctrinal belief by Guru Gobind Singh that when everything else fails, it's okay, when you've exhausted all other means, it's okay to fight for justice. So when we look at 1984, perhaps we need to look at in context of what happened from 1947 onwards, and was it really the Sikhs who were violent, or was it the government of India who became violent? This will be a good place to take a question. So I am going to take one right now. There is no mic. Gurpal Singh from Edmonton asks, what about Bhindranwale's speeches on YouTube, for example? He does say that we'll cut down 5,000 Hindus in an hour or something along those lines. First of all, Gurpal Singh, thank you for asking that question. Secondly, I would say is let's look into what you're asking. Yes, there are lots of questions like that, and I, in fact, entertained a couple of those, and Kirpa mentioned a few of those as well. But the one you are asking, can you find me? I have gone through, and I'm sure I missed several things. I have gone through all his speeches, and they have been translated, by the way. If you don't understand them in Punjabi, they have been translated in English by Dr. Ranbir Singh Sandhu. And in context, he has put everything. There is no such statement where he said he will kill 5,000 Hindus. Just like there is a disinformation campaign, we got to watch out for. Watch the YouTube videos. First of all, I don't know what YouTube video will have because there was no video of those. There are very few videos. It's mostly audio tapes. But I encourage all of you who are here to at least read the translation and their context. The book is called Struggle for Justice. If I take the spirit of your question, which I'll do for now to answer it in a different way, were there places where Bhindranwale made these kind of statements? In the entire speeches he has given, there is no anti-Hindu statement of killing Hindus. There is one exception to that. And I'm going to talk about that exception so all of us know what is happening. But it's very important to talk about the context of that. In Chandu Kalan, there is an incident in Chandu Kalan, which is in Haryana, where Uh, you got to know a little bit more, so we don't have much time, but let me just present like this. So if you don't know, Jarnail Singh Pindrawale was also the head of Damdami Taksal, which is sort of like a missionary school, you can say, of a sort. This is where the traditional practices of understanding Gurbanis were given to individuals, and they used to go in villages and cities and propagate the ideas of Sikhi. So in Chandu Kala, the idea was Damdami Taksal used to have their literature, their pothis, Guru Granth Sahib's beads, and other things in their bus, which used to be called like touring university essentially. And they were in this village called Chandu Khala. Police came to see Jarnail Singh Pindrawale there. He wasn't there, so they burned that bus. Now let me give you a context of that a little bit more. For Sikhs, it's a huge thing to desecrate Guru Granth Sahib. They didn't find him. They couldn't talk to him, so they burned a private property of its own citizens. And on top of that, it's not just a private property. This is something which Sikhs call Guru. So this is huge sentimental and inciting the sentiments of the Sikhs. This is done by police. When Jarnail Singh Pindrawala found out, he did give a statement in that context that if this is how government is going to treat me, the ratio of Sikhs to non-Sikhs in India is 35-1. In that context, he did say, he says, if you want to fight, if India and its agency wants to fight with us, this is what I know. The ratio is this. We are outnumbered, but we can fight. This is all he has said. So again, to sort of look into these kind of questions, I do want all of you to study the speeches carefully, look into what non-Sikhs are writing about him, those who knew him, those who dealt with him. That will give us a lot of insights into what is happening. I'll take one more question, then I'll move on. No mic from Sarabjit Singh in Bellevue, Washington. Question on slide number 22, okay, which is the current slide right now still. I would like to submit that in the modern day, we need to rethink what traditions make sense to follow today. My rational mind cannot comprehend how Sant Pindrawale was able to defend Golden Temple by following tradition of defending Golden Temple. They only served as bait for government to execute their dastardly agenda. Again, thank you for asking this, and I understand your viewpoint. But I think if you look into the context of what we have presented and not just look at the one single fact, there have been several facts presented that how was he a bait? The plan was already done 18 months before. Some people say, why did he go stay inside Darbar Sahib complex? Most people don't know that Pindrawale was already in Akal Takht complex for 2 years before the attack happened. So there are lots of, and again, this thing about rational mind, you and I might not understand certain things, and I'm not saying I endorse any of this, but I do want to present these contexts so we are able to evaluate for ourselves what does make sense. It's very easy for me and you and others to sit and do what I call Monday night quarterbacking. It's very different when you're in the middle of a scenario and you have to make certain decisions. What I'm trying to do is contextualize what happened, both from a Sikh angle as well as the independent source angle, and then I leave the rest up to you to see what you think makes sense or not. Okay, I'll move on. One of the things I want to get into is, which used to bother me a lot, so I started looking into it. What were the Indian intellectuals at that time thinking? And let me share something. One of the, in my personal opinion, the premier magazine in India, which really invites who's who of India to write about issues, is called Seminar. They do a monthly issue. So they did an issue on Punjab on April 1985 issue, and they titled that issue Using the Army. So this is my pretext to talk about Army now. And look at it's very carefully chosen title, Using the Army. Okay, who writes in this magazine? If you are aware of India's intellectuals, then Mr. Rustamji has written, General Thapar, the General Vass, and General Sinha has written in there. Former Minister of External Affairs Jaswant Singh has written. He is written there, and a senior lawyer Nandita Haskar has written in there. Eventually, the conclusion of that issue, I want you to go by that issue, find it, and read it. And this is the leading thinking magazine of India. This is what Ramesh Thapar concluded, that this was badly manipulated and short-sighted political management by the rulers. Look at the word choice. Manipulation, we understand, short-sighted political management by the rulers. So it's not even saying by government. So basically, there is this implication, the deduction we can do from this is that there were few dictatorial decisions being made. And let's look into that. Who were the rulers and how was army used by them? Okay, What's the army's position on this? Let's try to understand that. Army told the Prime Minister, we are of the opinion that the army should not be involved. Okay, Prime Minister's office responded, you have told me, basically saying get lost, we know what you think. This is written by General V. K. Nair in the book. You can read The Threat from Within, who was in charge of the Army headquarters of General Military Operations. So basically he's saying is the manner in which situation is being handled would only make it worse and may result in being dumped on the Army. The Army's involvement would have its ramifications within the Army and thereby the need to warn and prevent it. My point here of this slide is that Indian Army's position was they should not be involved. This is documented. And the Prime Minister's office basically said, okay, we heard you, move on, we'll see what we need to do. Okay, let's look into Indian generals who were involved and who were part of the debate and what they have said since then as well. General S.K. Sinha, who I quoted earlier, the one who told us that all this was a pre-planned attack, 18 months of training, he basically was asked to lead this operation. He said no. So they went to another general named Arun Vaidya. He said yes. In a book called A Soldier Recalls, they are basically saying General Vaidya was made the chief of army on other than merit considerations. So what is this saying? Because he became the yes man. And let me contextualize that. Southern Army Commander General T.S. Oberoi has also written that Vaidya was a Sikh man. What I am going after here is that since the whole media and the government has a campaign to do character assassination of the Sikh style of generals or the Sikh preachers or the Sikh leaders, we need to look at not even from a Sikh angle what Sikhs say about these guys. Let's look at what the Indian Army generals themselves say about their own generals, the ones who agreed to do these. And I want to answer one more thing. I had a chance to talk to Brigadier Manjeet Singh, who is he's an MVC decorated hero of Jaffna War of Sri Lanka. He fought on behalf of the Indians. He basically was saying that essentially since Sam Manekshaw, who was probably the most known general in India, they haven't really had a good general. They're all willing to play the game. And Brigadier Manjeet Singh, when I asked him, what does he know about the circumstances and context of June 84, his reply basically was, well, they're all yes men. He says, I'm personally friends with Sundarji. And Sundarji was stationed at Chandi Mandir, which is outside Chandigarh, from which the Operation Blue Star for June 84 was directed. He said that Sundarji disclosed to him that he is doing this not because it makes sense, because it will be detrimental for his career if he doesn't do it. And when Brigadier Manjeet Singh in his official capacities brought this to their notice, Brigadier Manjeet Singh was court-martialed because he had militant tendencies. So first they gave him MVC, then they tell him that he has militant tendencies to question what army was doing. Actually, it's not what army is doing, what one or two yes men generals were doing, because army was already of the opinion this shouldn't be done. Okay, let's look into a little bit about what Sundarji's wife writes. Sundarji was in charge. So General Vaidya is the highest level general. Sundarji is the one who is running it from Chandi Mandir, so second level of command. He didn't go in the complex, but he's running the operation. Sundarji's wife has written this in 2000 in a book called A Soldier Remembers. After Operation Blue Star, he was a changed man. Somber, his laughter all but gone. He shrugged away my concern, assuring me I'll get over it, but he never did. I have been trained to fight an enemy, not to tackle our kind, he said. This stuff is really important, guys, because army cannot be used for against its own citizens. But as Seminar magazine concluded, the rulers in Delhi chose the army against its own wishes, and because several generals were being let go who weren't implementing the orders, the person who actually implemented the order, he himself was a change man after June 84. This is important to note. This is very similar to what General Dwyer's wife writes, the guy who was involved in Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Very similar to what she wrote is exactly this, that he was a changed man. Something has changed in him because you're living with blood on your hands. Okay, now let's come back to the third agency. Remember I mentioned third agency earlier, that this was a special agency set up by the Mrs. Gandhi, and it was headed by R.N. Kao. So the white paper of Indian government says that large quantities of weapons and ammunition and explosives were recovered, including automatic and anti-tank weapons. Basically what they're saying is, in Darbar Sahib complex, so-called terrorists, the one they went inside to capture, had large amounts of ammunition. Well, this is what government of India says. Okay. According to Surya magazine, who really took these weapons inside there? The third agency kept the supply of lethal weapons flowing into Golden Temple. So they are the ones who actually were putting it inside. Third agency allowed 47 railway stations to be blown up. The third agency incited violence in Punjab, and for their gallant roles, senior officers of the third agency have been awarded with police medals and prized foreign postings. Point here is that it was the intelligence agency of the Indian government who planted these things and created a negative image of the Sikhs in Punjab. I want to get into a little bit more about General Barar, since we are on the army and the generals and the weapons. General Barar is the one. There were two generals who were on the scene, and this is really important in today's context as well. That the two generals who went inside the complex to attack were both of the Sikh descent, General K.S. Barar and R.S. Dayal. And then General Barar wrote a book justifying what he did, and his book was reviewed by Indian Defense Review. Okay, so my point here is that Indian generals are evaluating the version of General Barar, and this is what they have to say. First thing, Major General Afsir Karim says, one wishes Barar's attempts to explode what he calls certain myths had been more convincing. So the Indian army generals are not convinced with Barar's accounts. And Indian Defense Review concluded Operation Blue Star was a failure. Why? For two reasons. He says because Akal Takht was damaged beyond recognition even before Pindrawale and his followers were killed or captured. So they actually didn't go inside there to capture Pindrawale. They went there to demolish Darbar Sahib. That's what he's writing. Major collateral damage was caused to the temple complex, and there were a large number of civilian casualties, etc., etc. And second thing is this, and this is where I was referring to whether they really had the weapons. So Indian Defense Review, Indian general is writing that it is intriguing that if the police and the government really believed that the militants had only 200 to 250 weapons, the majority of which were 12-bore guns and 303 rifles, where was the need to call in the army? So the propaganda which the government, not the army itself, and certain generals, 2-3 generals did, it's completely being questioned by the Indian Army's generals. Let's continue on this. The former Chief of Army Staff, General Shankar Roy Chaudhary, was asked whether the right steps were taken in Punjab. This is what he wrote. No, certainly not. I don't think that right steps were taken. And the bold is ours. He says Operation Blue Star was totally unwarranted and a mistaken step. The party in power at Delhi at the time had taken the step more on political consideration. My point is, look at what the Indian Army generals have been saying. And they're all been essentially saying, with the exception of a couple of yes men, it was pre-planned, it was unwarranted, they used us, they threatened us, they are the ones who planted through their intelligence sources after the attack weapons in Darbar Sahib complex. Let's get a little bit into casualty figures. The government figure says there were 493 terrorists and others killed. Citizens for Democracy and Independent Inquiry, headed by Justice SikhRI, said at least 8,000 were dead, which included thousands of pilgrims and SGPC employees and volunteers. The battle, they said, lasted 56 to 60 hours. Government, these are the questions we have for government as to no effort was made to identify the dead or inform their relatives. So even if we go by the figures of Citizens for Democracy, 8,000 people are dead. There are no records being kept and families are not being involved. And why are they being cremated immediately? Why are no postmortems? Why are in the hurry to get rid of these bodies? Why are there no autopsies to figure out what really happened? No medical aid, water, food provisions for the victims. People who survived or were helping the victims, there were no provisions given to them. And Christian Science Monitor mentions on Saturday, medical workers in Amritsar said soldiers had threatened to shoot them if they gave food or water to Sikh pilgrims wounded in the attack and lying in the hospital. So, okay, hearts in their prayers in their hearts and humility on their lips is what General Barar said, and this is what Christian Science Monitor tells us. So you can see who you want to believe. Immediately after that, there was another operation, Operation Woodrose, where Sikh men between the ages of 15 and 35 were picked up in Indian villages and killed to instill fears. So the point is, we have focused quite a bit on Darbar Sahib complex, but similar operations were happening throughout Punjab, who were picked up blindfolded, and they are still missing. Point is, they were killed basically. Citizens of Democracy eventually concluded, and this was headed by a High Court Justice V.M. Tarkunde. He essentially said it was a massacre, mostly of innocents, and that's the main idea I want to drive home. Let's look into, before some conclusions, and then I'll take some questions. The whole point of this exercise today was June 84, as the government said, well, this was about that, the terrorists had seized the temple, and this was to flush out the terrorists. Every independent source available, every account available to us within the Indian Army and the Indian intellectuals. I have not cited you any Sikh reference here. They're all non-Sikh references, Western and Indian. Everything shows that June 84 was actually not about flushing out the terrorists. It was pre-planned, premeditated attack on Sikhs everywhere. And the reason I say that is because every Sikh, whether they agreed with the politics of this or not, including people like Khushwant Singh, every single Sikh felt the pain of what happened. Why? They gave back their medals. They disagreed with what happened. So we really need to look at this. Is this really about few people, 38 people, or is this really about Sikhs at large, about their spirit, about what they stand for? And I'll get into that. Second thing I want all of us to think about is, what the hell does it mean when people say, let's move on? Including the current Prime Minister of India, 2 days before 2 elections 2 weeks ago in India, 2 days before elections, he said that, let's move on. It's time to move on. What does this mean? I would like to understand that. In our family, if somebody dies of natural death, we remember them every year on the anniversary. Here, people have been killed en masse, and we are being asked without any accounts of justice and accountability and reparation to move on. No moving on can occur unless we have some sort of a truth commission, unless we agree that this is what happened and get rid of the propaganda wars. So I really want all the Sikhs and non-Sikhs everywhere in the world to really understand, what does this mean to move on? It's essentially, when somebody says move on, they're saying don't deal with the issue. And if you don't deal with the issue, people will respond their own ways, and some will write about it, some will talk about it, some will commit suicides, some will pick up arms. Different things happen. Unless you deal with the issue, a regular psychology student can tell you, you cannot move on unless you have dealt with the reality, the issues. And the third thing is, there is a large conspiracy of silence on this issue. There's a saying, when Holocausts are denied, not only are you denying the Holocaust, you're giving rise to the newer ones. Look at what happens in the Indian context and in the world context. Because people who do these things, they get away with it, more atrocities continues. So silence is definitely not the answer. Taking the fifth in the American parlance is not an option. People have to have a dialogue on these things, and we have to call spade a spade. It's actually a bit inviting that finally in India, within the Indian media also, this year, there is some debate going on at a mass level about what really happened in '84. And we need to continue that. We need to have a dialogue. We need to relate to the pain of the people instead of always questioning what really happened or made sense or not. What really happened is, again, Monday night quarterbacking. Yes, we do need to understand it, but let's understand it in its proper context. And this is not really about whether I agree with a political figure or a political movement. This is about, does it make sense what we are hearing, or is it a propaganda war? Okay, this is a good time to take some more questions, and I'm gonna, there's a question from Harinder Singh in Whitby, Ontario. He doesn't have a mic, so I'll read his question. In June '84, if Santji had offered to leave the complex, would this have prevented the military to enter there and then? Was such an offer made by Santji? Is there any record of communication attempts by internal leaders and the oppressors? If the military campaign was only to get to a group of people, then there must have been attempts beforehand to communicate. Did this happen? You have a lot of excellent questions, Harinder Singh ji, and I think you already have the answers to some of these. We can do conjecturing as much as we want. If this could have happened, if that could have happened, knowing what you know, that the planning was done 18 months in advance. Pindrawale had several political meetings. So did Harchand Singh Longowal. So did Toda. So did Badal. Why did they go if they really were going there to capture few people on the martyrdom day of Guru Arjan Sahib and people en masse are there? I mean, we can do all these conjecturings whether he should have left or not. I presented a Sikh context in there. Pindrawale was not the only one, by the way, who stayed in the temple. And let me mention that fact here as well. Ardas was done by all Akali leaders, that they will remain in Darbar Sahib complex and they will have their political agitation until the Sikh demands are met. What I personally find sometimes funny, awkward rather, is that those who, because in Sikh tradition, Ardas is huge. You don't leave after doing an Ardas until things are resolved. Those who did Ardas and stayed back, whether I agree or disagree again with them, we keep questioning them even after their highest testimony of dying for what they believe. Those who left after doing an Ardas with their hands in the air, we keep making them re-elected leaders and other things like that. So think about that. I mean, I think the question is not really about, again, Pindrawala the person. The question is not really about the political demands of the Sikhs. The question is about what happened in '84. Do I really understand what was the government's objectives? What was the army saying? What is the Indian intelligence here saying at the time? Okay, thank you for asking that. I'll take one more question from Jasjeet Singh in Leeds, UK. No mic, okay? The K word hasn't been mentioned yet, Khalistan. No, it just moved, so I have to go back. Sorry. So the K word hasn't been mentioned yet, Khalistan. Was there a movement for Khalistan growing in Punjab in 1984? Also, were the Khadkus and how were they organized? Thanks. Thanks for asking this, Jasjeet Singh. Excellent question. I think it's a little bit outside the context today. As I mentioned, we are not really going to discuss the issue of Khalistan today or the K word or other words. But again, we don't shy away from discussing any issue. This is not the focus today, but I do want to mention in context of June '84, I will mention this much, that Pindrawale was one of the spokespersons, Jathedar Pindrawale, a spokesperson of the Sikh leaderships at the time. Others being, Todas and Longowal and other people like them. Okay. In this context, Pindrawale did say that we are not demanding Khalistan, but if Darbar Sahib, if Indian government ever enters or attacks Darbar Sahib complex, it'll be the foundation stone of Khalistan. So the point of that, if we interpret, is that Khalistan was not a demand of the Sikhs at the time. He also, in this context, in his speeches, said that we are not asking for it, but if the government gives it to us, we will not commit the mistakes of 1947. So I'll leave those for you guys to interpret. Point is that what happened in June '84, even the army itself, the government itself, which masterminded these campaigns, and the Prime Minister's office, they themselves don't say this was about Khalistan. And the third agency itself said this was more about to win electoral votes later that year, and this is why government attacked it. Okay. I would like to take one more question. No mic from Bellevue, Washington. There is no name, so I'll just read the question. Question is, Sikhs outside of Punjab were not necessarily impacted before June 1984. Is there Punjab politics angle leading up to June 1984? Where were Sikh community missteps? It doesn't add up in my mind that Indira Gandhi would arbitrarily decide one day to pick on Sikhs who were her staunch supporters to win an election. Okay, in the context of June '84, let me see if I can give a little bit of a more context. Sikhs outside Punjab, the Sikh diaspora, even now, is closely related to what happens in India and Punjab. Because who are we? With the exception of a small segment of Sikh community, which is second and third generation, mostly we are first generation and 1.5 generation, which means everything in India does affect Sikhs. June '84 is one of those events where every shade of Sikh was affected. And this is the point which we really need to understand. It wasn't whether they were Congressis, it wasn't whether they were Akalis, it wasn't that they were communists. There is a communist author or a comrade, people who believed in the communistic ideals in India, Marxists. People like Harinder Singh have written books about the 20th century history of the Sikhs, where they say, we really didn't even feel the emotions of Sikhi. Even we were feeling this is not right, this is wrong. Point is, yes, the politics of Punjab does have everything to do with it. But more importantly, the relationship between the Indian state from 1947 to 84 needs to be studied to understand this. And in this context, when there was emergency declared in India by Mrs. Gandhi, the only political party, there were individuals who spoke against it, the only political party who registered its complaint was the Akali party, and that also has to be seen in light of what we are discussing. Okay, thank you for asking that. I'll move on to the next question from Harlovleen Kaur in Toronto. There is no mic. Is there a movement that is trying to make a case for transitional justice, especially this year being the 25th anniversary? I think we should be knocking the doors of international bodies to get the justice for all of us. As we all, justice delayed is justice denied, as we all know. So what are we going to make of the theoretical knowledge that we have gathered for so many years? Something practical. Okay, thank you for asking that. And this is exactly what I want to get into. What can you and I do? Well, let's look into it. And then I'll try to answer your question. I think at minimum, we need to reflect on the why, question of why, which is what the earlier question was about, and maybe the one before that. Why did this happen? Well, I think there are two things we need to look at as Sikhs. One is internal one, that Sikhs have been at the receiving end of Kallukaras. So here is where I want to give some questions to all of you to think about. Should we really be protesting? Is that our tradition? Should we be actually presenting this as being a sad affair? Because every time before 84 when this has happened to the Sikhs, and there have been numerous, there were 7 times just in the 18th century, Sikhs never protested. Whether it was Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, he was a leader, whether it's in 47 era when Gurdwaras have been taken out under the Mahant control from the British, and they've been killed, and raping was going on in the Gurdwaras at that time. Sikhs were really never of the people of burning effigies and protesting. Sikhs were always about, let's go fight for justice. So Kallukara's context is very important to understand. Let's not only look at it as being purely in a government angle of, these things are going on because people are creating their own subsets in Gurdwara complexes. No, Kallukaras have been occurring. And why have they been occurring? I want to get into that a bit. Second thing we need to do is we need to look at it from external angle. Globally and locally, oppressions are everywhere. Whether it's the First Nations in US and Canada, whether it's the Aborigines in the oceanic level, whether it's the Dalit movements in India, you name it. Do we relate to the pain of the people? This is what we need to reflect on. At the end of the day, whether you agree with one's version or disagree with someone else's version is not really matter. Does it really matter? What matters is, as a Sikh angle, as Guru Nanak Sahib writes in his own words, that when Babur attacked Hindustan, I am not only feeling the pain of the Hindu women, I'm also feeling the pain of the Muslim women who have to live through this kind of nonsense. This is the sensitivity Guru Nanak demands from all of us. So my question is, let's reflect on that sensitivity, regardless of our political ideologies, and we know they're going to be from left to right in various shades. Can we at least relate to the pain of people in this world? If you are able to relate to it, then you might be able to go to the next level, which is about reviving the spirit. All this information gathering needs to really go towards reviving the spirit, and which I'm calling the Sikh spirit. And what is that Sikh spirit? Well, the most authors and most of the Gurbani, as I have understood, talks about we really need to evaluate our personal values. What do I stand for? Forget about what state stands for. Once the reflection is done, we need to change our own spirit. I need to change my spirit. As Professor Sardar Jagjit Singh has written in his thesis of Sikh Revolution, he says the Sikh Revolution of Guru Nanak was successful because Guru Nanak focused on the value patterns of an individual. He empowered the individual to relate to everything within him or her and around him and her. And if you're able to do that, we are ready to fight religious and political domination. This is the Sikh history. Kallukaras occur, attacks on Sikhs occur. We shouldn't be complaining about it. We shouldn't be crying about it, is one angle I want to present, because they will only occur to those people who believe in fighting for justice. Guru Nanak, through Guru Gobind Singh and the post-Guru period, all believed in fighting the domination by religions and the politics, the Qazis, the Mullahs, the Brahmins, the Mughals and the kings who served and conspired with the Mughals to defeat the Indians and the others. Gurus fought against them. Sikhs did this, whether it was under British, fighting the British, whether it is during Mughal period and whether it is under the Indian government period. We really need to look into, is my personal value in line with the Sikh value, which is fighting the culture of domination? And if we are able to do it, then you and I might be able to respond properly. And the first response needs to be to understand the realities. We need to counter the propaganda. We have to work hard at understanding the reality. What really happened? It's a very simple approach to go by what I am presenting today. It'll be overly simplistic to just agree with everything I have presented or agree with everything which government says. I think we need to invest our time into these things. Read some good books. Recently, Ganesha Kaur just presented her second edition, Lost in History 1984 Reconstructed. Read some books like that. Read what General Barar has written. Read what A.R. Darshi has written. Read that Seminar magazine. Look at some independent sources. And to create if you do nothing, nothing will happen. To create a better grasp, to have a more in-depthful idea, you have to read a lot and listen to several versions before you can decipher what is the reality. And once you're able to do that, spend your time and money. There are several organizations doing good things. I just mentioned one here in SAF. They are full-time dedicated to fighting these kind of things in a legal manner, and this goes to the last question which was asked. Yeah, they are the ones who are looking at the legal frameworks. Just talking about what legal options are available over one seminar and one Gurdwara talk or after dinner speech is not going to cut it. So the idea is to support those organizations who do this in a propaganda-free manner, and that's what counts. I'll take one or two more questions because we are almost out of time. I hope I was able to answer Lavleen's questions here. Narinder Pal Singh from Whitby, he has other questions. We are far removed from this in time and distance. How do we make anyone care about it? What are your thoughts on this? But I just shared some of those thoughts. What can you and I do? It really is not about, see, I was talking to Jaskaran, who is the ED of and the co-founder of NSAF, who actually devotes their time to fight impunity in India. 100% of their time, that's what they do, and they're very qualified people. And they were saying, in case certain movements in South America, it took the efforts of the grandmothers for 25 years to document everything before government agreed to change their attitude. In case of Armenia, it's taken 80 years. We need to go away from the culture of instant gratification. We don't do things because we will see results in our lifetime. We must do things because it's the right thing to do. This is why the Sikh angle demands we need to evaluate our personal values and then respond to things. I'm going to take a last question, and then we'll be done and we'll be asked to evaluate the webinar today. Sarabjit Singh from Bellevue asks, what are the lessons learned for Sikh community to get our rights as minorities? Can we use armed resistance against modern governments that won't respect human rights? Take Sri Lankan campaign against Tamil or even US and Iraq. I think this is a little bit outside of the context today, but I understand the spirit you're asking me this from, and thank you for asking. I think what we really need to look at is the first part of your questions. What are the lessons learned for us in order for us to get our rights as minorities? Minority rights are an issue everywhere in the world. We need to become an active participant, an active agent in working towards those. Every movement has its own criteria. It depends a little bit on the world scenarios. At minimum, all of us need to become active in learning about the issues. And if you ask me from a Sikh angle, if you do that much, then you go stand in front of Guru Granth Sahib and do an ardas and ask the Guru, what should I do? Don't let an individual or organization tell you what to do. It's between you, your strengths, your capabilities, and your scenarios. Every other answer will be a manufactured answer. You need to come up with your own response. With that, thank you for attending the webinar today. I hope I gave you a few things to think about. I know thinking was more from a little bit from a Sikh angle, but mostly from independent sources. So I hope you're able to look at those, come up with your own opinion, look at the larger issues of life, and don't get caught up into conjecturing and the propaganda wars, either from a Sikh side or from the Indian government side. At the end of the day, it's about feeling the pain of your community as well as other communities in the world and looking at in your own way how to respond to that pain. Thank you again. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.